got your attention now, don't I?
This is the Black Rifle Coffee Podcast. Prepare to get caffeinated.
So how do you pronounce your name? Is it Josh or?
Yes, it's Josh.
Oh.
Joshua.
Joshua.
Yeah.
Is that Cherokee? Is that that what that is?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. How do you pronounce your name? Is it Andy? Is it Stumpf?
Yes, Stumpf.
The owner of Black Rifle Coffee?
Yeah, exactly. Just so everybody's listening, make sure that you direct all hate mail towards the true CEO of Black Rifle Coffee, Andy Stumpf. He's got a podcast called Cleared Hot. But you can go ahead and meme him for the next couple weeks. That'd be great.
Yeah, I wore my Cleared Hot podcast shirt. I figured since I was going to be talking to the owner of Black Rifle Coffee today, Andy.
Yeah. This is a good start, man.
Yeah.
This is a good start. I'm glad to have you. So Montana Knife Company, what do you guys make?
We make spoons that identify as knives. We make knives. I've been a custom knife maker kind of forever, but I launched the production brand of knives, Montana Knife Company, last year.
Right.
And it's just kind of exploded. So, yeah, it's pretty cool.
Well, a few things that I knew about you and didn't know about you, which is, quite a lot, I would imagine. One, Lucas, I believe, was telling me, were you the youngest to have you'll have to explain this. So what's the age and the certificate or the type of, what is it, master?
Yeah, master bladesmith. So I mean, kind of going back a little bit, I started making knives when I was 11. My Little League baseball coach started teaching me, Rick Dunkerley. And I was just a typical kid in Montana, loved hunting and fishing and all that, everything. And he would bring his hunting knives to practice and show the other dads. And, as a kid, I thought they were awesome. So my parents bought me one and he started teaching me. And I kind of took to it. I mean, whether he wanted me to come to a shop or not, I kind of kept inviting myself.
Right.
It kind of took off. So I joined the American Bladesmith Society when I was 12. I think 13, and you have to be a member 2 years before you can test.
Okay.
For a certification of any level.
Right.
And so at 15, I tested for and became the youngest journeyman knife maker in the world. And then you have to be a journeyman for at least 2 years. I was a journeyman for about 4 years, and I became a master smith at 19.
Is that the youngest?
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
And I feel a little awkward sometimes about it. I mean, it's a cool accomplishment, but to be like, I don't consider myself a master of anything even at this age. Right. Definitely at 19. Like, what are you really a master of anything at 19? So, I passed the test and I accomplished those goals, but really that's when still the learning just began. It's just something I and you see sometimes makers get that level and they're like, all right, I'm good. I'm done learning. I'm a master. But for me, I actually changed a lot of my processes and a lot of what I do a couple years later when I met some other makers that were super accomplished. And, Tim Hancock, who's passed away, he was like, hey, we need to change some things you're doing here. And even today, like I'm constantly, whether it's from Lucas or anybody, I don't care what level knife maker, if there's a better way to do something, I'm all ears, Well,
it's interesting to me because you started at such a young age. So at 11, did you know this was something that you were going to be doing for the rest of your life?
I mean, I felt like it at that point. It was something that just triggered with me. And I was making knives before school, after school. And this definitely wasn't a case of, I made a couple knives in Rick's shop. And then he was like, if you really want to do this, you got to kind of do it on your own. And so I had a lawn mowing business. And my parents also, they still own a construction business where we had backhoes and excavators and all that. And So I would make money in my lawn mowing business, and then I bought my first belt grinder, and then I started buying equipment. And my dad had a spot for me in his shop, and he's pretty clean, pretty detailed.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm in there fogging the shop up with my belt grinder, grinding wood and steel. And he's like, okay, we need to get you the hell out of my shop. So he enclosed a little lean-to machine shed, just a spot in there for me. And we moved my stuff out there. And it's kind of funny. There's pictures of me grinding in my little coverall, Carhartt coveralls, and he put a milk crate in there. He built my grinder bench level at the height that he thought I would be at someday.
Right.
And then I stood on a milk crate for the next 2 or 3 years making knives. But, it's one of those things like, I don't know, sometimes people, it seems like, oh, you're lucky to be where you're at or whatever. And it's like, look, man, I wasn't going to parties. I wasn't doing a lot of things. Like I was in my knife shop freaking grinding knives. I mean, I was working. That's one thing I'll say for myself. Like I worked hard as a kid at getting better. And honestly, you don't get to a high level of anything, especially that young, without a lot of help. So I had a lot of mentors. At times, frustrated, I wanted to quit.
Right.
Because I would show my knives to Rick or to other makers. I remember Tim Hancock. I mean, I was a master smith. I was 21 years old, and I'd bring a knife to the Atlanta Blade Show. And I was really close with a lot of older guys, and I would actually room with them at these, and I would soak their brains right out of their head, asking them questions. And I'd hand like Tim a knife that I thought was really good, and he'd be like, yeah, I don't like it. And then he would just tear it apart and be like, this could be better, and you should have done this, and why did you do this? And instead of getting frustrated or pissed off, I would just go back and like, I'm going to show him, or I'm going to do better, know. But as a kid, that was hard. I remember several times like telling my mom I quit. I'm
really?
Crying and just frustrated because like you think like you just made the greatest knife, and looking back on it now, it's like, yeah, they should have ripped it apart,
right?
So it's funny, when I went to my first knife show, Eugene, Oregon, I was 13. We left and we got in the car and we got to the end of the driveway, and Rick Dunkerley and some other guys, Barry Gallagher, these guys, we were in an old like Chrysler or New Yorker or some big boat car, and I'm in the back seat. And we get to the end of my parents' driveway, and Rick turns around to me and says, your parents think I'm a respectable fucking human? And he goes, and we're going to keep it that way. So anything you hear in this car stays in this car. And it was cool because we went to the Eugene show, and I actually didn't even have a ride home. Like they were staying out there, and Rick's like, we'll find him a ride. And this guy, Wade Coulter, long hair down to his waist, kind of looked like a hippie guy or whatever. He worked at a power plant in Colstrip, Montana, making knives. Great human. But at the time, we didn't know him.
Right.
And Rick asked him if I could ride home with him. And I called my mom, and I'm like, I found a ride home. He's got long hair and an earring, but he's really nice. So, it was a cool time for sure. And I see a lot of parents these days overprotective, not,
right.
Like think about that. We didn't have cell phones. I mean, my parents kicked me loose, and I mean, I called them probably twice from Oregon, from the hotel room.
Right.
And the rest of the time I was just in the, across the country doing what I was doing. And I think more people with kids need to try to get them more experiences, take them to somebody who welds or grinds or, does whatever, plumber, and let them learn a trade, but let them, trust them to, kids can be pretty responsible.
Right.
And my parents use it against me. If I was going to potentially get in trouble, my dad was like, I'll lock your shop. And I didn't want that to happen. So I stayed pretty straight and narrow,
Well, when you were in your teens and you were making knives, were you selling those to other people in high school or, junior high and high school? Where were you selling them? Or were you just making them to make them?
No, my first couple knives, I kept my first knife. I still have it. But my second and third knives, I sold to my science teacher and my math teacher.
Really?
Yeah. I did a little heat treating of steel science fair project, and I brought a couple finished knives. I sold them for $20. They bought them. And it's funny, both of those people ended up giving them back to me 20 years later.
Really?
Yeah, it's kind of cool. But no, I started selling knives kind of locally, and then I went to that show.
Yeah.
And then every year from there on out, I mean, as a kid, I went to the Atlanta Blade Show every year. I went to Oregon. When I was in high school, I started going to the New York City show in Times Square.
Wow.
So I was selling knives, and then Blade Magazine was really good to me. The editor of Blade, Steve Shackelford, I had a lot of coverage as a kid, especially when I started, testing for these different levels. When I was 15, I was on the cover of Blade Magazine and all these different things. And so it's cool because like I was getting letters from Europe, from London, and letters from all over the country of people ordering knives from this kid. And honestly, it got overwhelming.
Really?
Yeah, when I was probably a senior in high school, I kind of had to just like scrap the order list and say, it's hard because it's exciting, but if you get, Lucas and I've talked about this, if you get 1,000 orders for the knife you're making today, how do you get better for tomorrow?
Right.
So like, you got to be able to progress. And I had some good advice from guys of like, you're 18 or you're 17, like forget those orders. Like it's nice that they ordered them, but restructure it and try to sell knives like, hey, call them and say, okay, your name's up. Here's what I'm making today, or make knives and sell them, but try to push yourself outside your box, make something different and try things, otherwise you just get stuck in a rut.
How many knives do you think you made by the time you graduated high school?
I'm sure I made at least a couple hundred.
Really?
Yeah, because back then those knives are pretty easy to make. They were simple little 3-piece knives. It's interesting. The knives that I was making back then are somewhat similar in style to the knives that we're making with Montana Knife Company, where they're a simple, just strong, good using knife. I mean, my knives back then weren't as well constructed. I mean, I was learning, but no bells and whistles. It's not about a bunch of fluffy shit. It's like this knife's made to use. As I progressed, I really went towards the art knife part of it for years. Like I was, how good can I get? And I had all these mentors that were incredibly talented. And so I was pushing myself, using, 18 karat gold and fossilized ivories and all, learning carving and all these different things. So, I was really trying to push myself to a high level, but it is a hard way to make a living, because when you're making one knife at a time, if you work on it for 3 weeks and you screw it up, you lose that income.
Right.
I was full-time for about 10 years in my 20s or so and 30s. And it's a hard way to raise a family, because if you go hunting for a week, you don't make money for a week.
Yeah.
Well,
but didn't you have another job?
I did after I was full-time for about 10 years, that 08 timeframe hit with the markets. And it's like, if you listen to the news that, we're headed into a depression and it's into the world. I had 4 young kids, and it was kind of one of those, selfishly, I just wanted to keep making knives.
Right.
But as a, family guy, it's like, okay, what's best for the family? And honestly, $5,000 knives are the first thing to leave a budget.
Right. Yeah.
And so I had a couple year backlog, and I would call people and say, hey, I'm about ready to start your knife. And they're like, well, I just kind of want to wait a little while, see what this market does. And it's like, holy shit, this is kind of fragile.
Yeah.
Like overnight, it felt like. And so I had an opportunity to take a job through a friend of mine. He kind of helped me get on just actually operating backhoe for a local power company. And I got that job, went to work there. And then I quickly transferred over to the electric side. And in the end, I ended up doing an apprenticeship and became a journeyman lineman for the power company, working on power lines. So
how long did that take?
That process is a 3-year apprenticeship. Right. So I was there for probably 5 years. I was initially just kind of a grunt.
Right.
And then got an apprenticeship and went through that and became a journeyman.
So you're doing that, but you had to have been making knives too, like in the evenings and the mornings, right?
I was, yeah. And, I ended up kind of in that time frame, got a divorce. And so I was kind of doing the full-time dad, 4-kid thing. And honestly, knives took a little bit of a back seat. But forever, I had this idea of this production company I wanted to own. So when I was 19, I actually purchased the, through the state, or registered the name Montana Knife Company.
Really?
So from the time I was 19 to last year, like I had this idea of what I wanted to do. But I knew timing-wise, financially, personally, like a lot of different things, it wasn't right yet.
Right.
So when I was doing the kind of single dad thing and whatnot, we split our kids half time. So when I didn't have the kids, obviously I was able to do a little more knife work. But where things changed is when I met my new wife. When I met Jess, like all of a sudden she was incredibly supportive, and right away she started pushing like, you need to get back into making knives. And I kind of as a little bit of a jump back into it, like hey, I'm back. I went and did that TV show Forged in Fire.
Yeah. How do you, before you start on that, did you get the call for that? Did you call them? Like, how did that entire thing happen?
Originally, I got called to ask if I wanted to be a judge on it. And I was like, no, I can't spend 3 or 4 or 6 months a year in New York, you know? And also, I'm pretty protective of my craft of knife making, and I didn't want to be part of any bullshit thing that made knife makers look like clowns. Or I'm like, we'll see what this is all about. And not that I was they were going to try different guys out for being a judge. It's not like I was the only pick, but I was in the mix. And so I saw the first season and they represented the craft pretty well. There's little things that, always you'd like to see it done a little better, but it's pretty good. And so I always tell my kids not to be afraid of a challenge.
Right.
And there's a lot of knife makers out there that are like, fuck that show. That's, it's bullshit, blah, 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 blah. Like, but a lot of it is honestly, I think people are afraid to fail in public.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you're putting yourself out there. And I consider myself, it's not just like a little hobby craft thing. Like I consider myself a professional, like a doctor or a lawyer or a dentist or whatever. Like I'm a professional in my craft. And, I want to represent knife making that way. And I saw some stuff going on in that show, and it's like, I think I can go on there and represent pretty well. And number 2, I want to look at my kids and be able to say, I accepted the challenge and wasn't afraid of failing.
Right.
And I went on there and did pretty well. I made the finals both times I was on there. I didn't win either time. I think the first time was kind of debatable, but the second time, I got short on time and my heat treat, my edge chipped on the very last test. But, that's a part of it. I mean, that's the thing. Like you have 5 days to make something, and I made 2 incredible swords in 5 days and pushed as much time into those as I could and just got a little short on time on the last one. But still, if you look at what I built, it was pretty cool.
Yeah, we were going through that book that you had up at TAC, and that was the first time I'd really taken a look at what you built. It's incredible that you can do that in 5 days. I didn't understand that you could only work, was it 8 hours a day on the show?
Yeah.
I didn't realize there was a time restraint either, which you and I were both talking about it. And you're like, yeah, going in, I was like, I'll work like 16-hour days. I'll bust this thing out.
Right.
But it makes sense now that we had that conversation that they have to put a time cap because they have to equalize the playing field.
Right.
Or people would just probably work
some old
24
guy
hours a day.
Can't do more than 10 hours and the next guy's doing 22 hours a day.
Yeah.
And the camera crew, I mean, they have to sleep too. So
right. But you were on there twice. How long in between the first and the second time that you were on it?
Probably, I mean, basically a year. It was more like they called pretty quickly after. It was probably 6 months or something like that. But it was a good experience. And it's cool because like on the second one I went against Mareko Malmasi. He's a chef's knife maker out of Washington. He's become one of my really great friends.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, that guy's incredible too.
Yeah.
Like he is.
Yeah, Mareko's awesome. So, and we became, close. I talked to him often, and there's some things I haven't announced yet, but like he's going to be kind of involved with helping us with MKC. Brought him on. So we haven't actually put anything out there about that, but that's going to be cool. So that's what's cool about the knife making craft is everyone's so tight. It's such a tight knit group, especially back when I was coming up. There was no internet,
right?
So if you wanted to learn something, you had to go to somebody's shop. Right. There was no YouTube,
right?
Like I traveled when I was 14. Yeah, 14. I went from Montana to South Carolina, flew standby across the country with no cell phone to visit George Heron for a week in a shop, who was an old legend of a knife maker. He was probably 70 at the time. I spent a week with him and flew back home just to go learn, and that's kind of that whole part of like, as parents, my parents just trusted me where I was responsible, and they're like, yeah, go learn. It's a great experience, and I don't think they heard from me until I got to South Carolina. I was bumped on like every connection. I was bumped at least once sitting in the airports,
At 14, just cruising across the United States. I don't think my dad would have trusted me to do that. I'd steal his cars at 14. I'd take him on joyrides. He definitely would be like, yeah, you're not going anywhere. You're going to end up like hurting yourself.
Yeah.
So did people, when you're in junior high and high school, because you're doing so much of this, did people just look at you like you were a nerd, or was it?
Yeah, I think a few kids probably thought it was kind of cool, but mostly, I feel like I definitely got a lot of shit about it. Like, oh, you're building your stupid knives again this weekend. Like, why don't you come to, whatever? And it's like, I'm going to be in my shop. And so I don't feel like I had a lot of support from peers really when I was in school. It became cooler like after I graduated,
As people get older, they realize what you were doing and how cool it actually was. And then they probably started coming back to you going, dude, can I get one of those?
Yeah. That there was definitely some of that for sure. Yeah.
Like one of my really close friends, he used to make antler art, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And we would always be like, dude, because he'd go out and shed hunt all the time. And we're like, dude, why are you shed hunting? And then once he told me how much money he could get from sheds, it's like, I get it now. Okay, I got it. I understand why you're shed hunting. But when you don't understand at that age, you're like, what the fuck are you doing walking around in the mountains picking up sheds? It was like, I want to track the elk. I want to see what's going on with the whitetail. I want to be able to build stuff. And oh, by the way, we make a lot of money doing this.
Right.
And every year, you'd have, and I'm sure you guys have them in Montana, they'd have stations at like grocery stores and a few of those where they would buy sheds. So they'd have all this,
they still do it.
Still do it. Yeah. Here, not so much. I haven't seen one in Utah, but they still do it.
Yeah, it was, and I'll be honest, like at that age too, I was motivated by money, right? Like when I was a kid and I got $20 for a knife, like, sweet, I made money at something I like to do.
Right.
And then I remember, the knife I made when I first got $100 for a knife, and then $200. I remember one when I got $400, a collector in Oregon. I still remember the knife. Like, there were those different stages on up to, a sword when I finally got, I got $30,000 for a sword. Yeah. So it's like, but it's always been just steps of like improvement. And
can you tell me what's the most expensive sword or knife you've ever sold? Would you disclose that?
Yeah, I mean, it was that sword.
Was it?
A couple of those swords were it was $37,000.
That is crazy.
Yeah.
Can you tell me who you sold them to? Not the exact person, but did they stay in the States? Did they go overseas?
That one went overseas to United Arab Emirates.
Okay.
And that was a really cool experience because I had just bought the place that I live in now. That place was a total shithole. Beautiful piece of property, but weeds everywhere, no road into it. Like my dad and I built a road into it, and it was like a diamond in the rough, that property, which now it's gorgeous. But I was out building fence and I had a backhoe out there and I was pounding fence posts, and I get a call from this guy in England, and he's like, my friend would like you to build a sword. And I was like, yeah, well, I don't make swords, and he's like, well, he really likes your Damascus. Can you send us some samples? And I was like, well, maybe. And so then he emailed a couple times and he's like, can you send us some samples? And I was like, sure. And I was totally kind of blowing it off. And then finally, like a week before I was supposed to have him these samples of steel, I was building fence and just doing my thing. He calls me one day and he goes, can you just bring those samples here? And I was like, where? And he goes, London. And I was like, when? And he goes, Tuesday. And I was like, all right, maybe. And so sure enough, they bought me a first class ticket to London in 5 days. So, I mean, I like shut the backhoe off and like started forging my ass off. And I'm like, holy shit, And so as it turns out, he flew me to London and I met, he's a sheikh in Abu Dhabi, and actually a super nice guy in his 30s and super regular guy. Like I met him because I'm meeting some royal guy. Like I don't even know how I'm supposed to act, but I'm like, I'm not going to bow. That's one thing I remember. Like I'm not bowing to this guy. And, but he was super cool. We talked about hunting. He loves to hunt. He's like all bummed out. He would love to hunt Alaska but he can't. Like get tags or whatever. And we just talked normal stuff. And then I built that first sword, and then he flew me to Abu Dhabi to deliver it as a guest at a hunting show that they put on where
that's cool.
They had falcons flying everywhere. It was like a giant like safari club show in Abu Dhabi. And then he flew me to Istanbul, Turkey to look at a sword in the Topkapi Palace. Wanted me to build that. And,
so what was the sword?
The one that I looked at in the Wallace collection in London was a Kilij. Just a style of a sword. It's got a real upswept blade with a thick T on the spine, and it was made back in the 1700s for battling on horseback.
Okay.
And when you would strike somebody on horseback, that upswept blade would allow basically like the person to like slide off the sword where it wouldn't rip your sword out of your hand.
Oh, gotcha.
Those guys were savages. You think about back in the 1600s and 1700s and like the armor, and like when I was in the Wallace collection in London and looking at all that stuff, or if you go to the Metropolitan in New York and you see what those people were wearing into battle, like
it doesn't seem possible to fight in some of that.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always watch those, a movie or television show where they have scenes from the supposedly the Crusades, and you're like, dude, there is no way you would be able to fight like that in a suit of armor with a sword that weighs.
Yeah.
I mean, some of those broadswords were.
They were huge.
They were huge.
Heavy. Yeah.
And you see them like throwing them around, and you're like,
the people were little.
They were tiny.
Like when
they were like malnourished and like,
yeah. And you see the suits of armor, they're like for little people.
Yeah.
And it's like, it makes you wonder, like, God, were they kids? I mean, it's crazy. Yeah, no. And it makes me wonder how many of the actual, people on the front lines were actually wearing the armor, and how many of those suits of armor you see that were built were just for the guys in the back watching shit happen, Probably
that, right? Because if you had armor, that meant you were important enough to have it. Yeah. And, people at that point in time, I think they were more expendable at times, or at least psychologically, they were more expendable. So I'm sure you'd have your fodder at the front lines, and you'd have more important people, and then armor would eventually encroach, as history progresses towards the front line. But if you're going to take ground, you have to be mobile.
Right.
So some of that, I'm like, man, you just would not be mobile wearing that much, swinging a heavy sword. It's completely inaccurate, especially when you're 5'5".
Right. Exactly.
You're swinging
and you've
around
just
a
marched
sword.
800 miles.
It's like, and you wouldn't be marching in it either. That's the other thing that I kept, when we're talking about historical inaccuracies, like, they're just marching from like Paris to Jerusalem in their armor. No, they would never. They wouldn't be doing that.
No, but when you do look at those suits of armor in there, the ones that are the most ornate, I look at it from a craftsman level. Those people had to have worked on that stuff for years. Or like you are a dedicated, you're making the suit of armor for this guy.
Right.
And maybe it was generations. Like, I don't know. You read different stuff about like families that made, like this guy made armor, his son made armor, his son made armor. But you see the level of craftsmanship when you go into like that Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, Turkey. It's mind-boggling what those people created back then.
So do you know the history of like sword and blade making? Can you give me a summary?
I'm really not as much of a historian as I probably should be with what I do, but I've just not read enough or know enough. I like to look at the stuff, and I wasn't really interested in swords and a lot of that stuff when I was a kid. I was just interested in making what I was making.
Yeah.
As I've gotten older, and especially when I was doing that project, and I actually went to, like, I didn't know a lot of that stuff existed.
Right.
Because again, we didn't have internet.
Yeah.
And when I went and did that project, I'd probably had a cell phone for 2 years.
Right.
And I walked into some of those museums. Like when I remember the first time I went to the Metropolitan in New York and went to the Arms and Armor section, and it was just mind-boggling.
Really?
Like you could spend just a solid week in there and not see it all. It's mind-boggling. Just that section of that museum.
Do you look at some of the craftsmanship from hundreds of years ago and think, how did they do that?
I have no idea how.
Really?
Like, you don't even see a lot of that stuff being built today. Like, there's almost nobody that could afford it, or the people in our society right now that could afford it don't have any interest in paying for that to be built. But I mean, we're talking stuff that even today a craftsman would take years to do.
Really?
Like, I don't know how, you know, and we have belt grinders and air tools and gravers and all this stuff. And they're doing like all the engraving with freaking chisel and a hammer, you know, gravers and a hammer. Like, and we have, you know, graver Air Maxes that just, you know, and take carved lines. So that's probably the number one thing I think when I see that stuff is, I don't know how they did that. You know, there's so much cool history, whether it's the samurai stuff or like Sheffield, England, and the fact that they were running, you know, big stone wheels off of a belt that was driven by a wheel in the stream out back. Right. Like the ingenuity of how they powered, or even in Sheffield, how they powered their hammers with water wheels in the stream out back, like, you know, with belts running through the ceilings. And I'd love to go see all that someday. I know some of that stuff's still set up where you can go see how it was all done, but so I don't know as much history as I'd like to. And there's a lot of myth and kind of lore, like with Damascus steel, for example.
That's kind of where I'm getting to, is like the myths associated with regions and how things are made and what's actually superior quality. Because if you travel around the Middle East, anywhere you go, you know, the Saudi Arabians or, you know, the Kuwaitis or whomever, they'll be like, this is the best blade. And you're like, okay, dude, I've heard that from every one of you guys. Like, you all have the best blade, you know, and it's like Japanese are going to be partial to, you know, Japanese steel, sword making, knife making. So tell me some of the myths that you know of that are out there associated with, you know, blades that you've heard over the years that, you know, you can just like totally debunk.
Yeah, I think some of it, a lot of it boils down to like the Damascus steel and the samurais and the whole, you know, I think that, you know, from a lot of what I've been told, they thought the more that you forged and folded a piece of steel, the stronger it got. So, you know, I'll have people all the time come up and be like, how many layers is in that? And if you're like, oh, there's 200 layers. Oh, well, you know, I saw swords that had 2,000 layers and they're way stronger. And it's like, well, actually, it's all just steel. Like metallurgically, we know it's the alloys in the steel. It's what makes up that steel. It's how it's heat treated. It's not, in fact, if you forge on a blade too long and you do too much forging, as you're forging, you're burning carbon out of the steel. So you're actually starting to deplete that steel. So just because it's a Damascus blade doesn't mean it's stronger. In fact, if you don't do it right, there's a good chance it could be weaker if you're not welding it well. You know, but Damascus is really more done for the beauty of the blade and the art form of it. And forging in general, you know, back in the 90s, man, like the American Bladesmith Society, and then you had the Knifemakers Guild. Well, the guild were all guys who stock removed, just ground their blades out. And then you had the forging guys in the American Bladesmith Society. And there were certain people in those that just, you know, oh, those Knifemakers Guild guys and their shit soulless ground blades, you know, and like they're terrible and these forged blades are so much better. Forging is really, it's fun to do. It's exciting. It adds a level to the craft and kind of puts like your own soul into that steel. But really, like I said, when I did a demo the other night, you're taking a bar of steel that maybe is an inch wide and you can make a blade that's 1 3/4 wide and curved. It's more of a way to utilize steel that otherwise you'd have to buy a piece of steel 3 or 4 inches wide and grind it and cut it all away.
Gotcha.
So it's more, forging's done more in my case to utilize, if I make a really beautiful piece of Damascus, I don't want to turn that all into dust and put it on the floor of my shop. I can forge a blade out, and then maybe because I save that much material, I get another blade out of that same piece of steel. I get 2 knives. But it's really more about how you heat treat. So that with the samurai stuff and a lot of the Damascus kind of folklore, you know, I don't know. It was probably real hit and miss too. You probably had a swordsmith in one town that really had a process dialed in. That he was making killer stuff, and the next guy over, you know, was quenching it in goat blood and thought he had a real thing going on, and maybe they were shit. You know, I don't know. So it's hard to say.
Well, it's interesting because I hear, based on region, this is the best. I've heard this all the time. Like, these are the best sword makers. These are the best knife makers. What I've realized is, as I get older in life, anytime people say that they're the best, it's typically like that sign in a diner shop that says the best coffee in the world or whatever.
Right.
It's like, yeah, everybody says that shit.
Yeah. And the same with knives. Like, I'll have guys like, oh, you're the best knife maker, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, man, there are so many incredible knife makers out there. There's so many guys out there that are better than I am. Like, Lucas and I were just talking about this morning out in the shop before you got here. We were talking about how, I was telling Lucas, most custom knife makers are selling knives. They're selling themselves. People are buying knives because they like Lucas and his personality and his style. Or they're buying mine because they like my story and my style and me. And the guys that struggle are the guys with no personality that just kind of sit there like a bump on a log. And yeah, you might make a great knife, but you have to be able to sell yourself and be able to relate to people. And I think most knife collectors are collecting the people as much as they are the knives.
I would agree with that. I think, and I don't know the knife community like you, obviously, but as a guy that I would consider myself a knife aficionado, I guess, to a certain degree. I see knives and I'm like, that's really cool, or that's a piece of history, or I really like that knife maker, so I'm going to buy them. So I think there's a combination of interest there.
Yeah.
I'm always amazed as to the knife community, because it's a very unique subculture of collectors that you guys have a very specific kind of subculture over there. I don't think a lot of people understand how close and tight knit it is. And then two, how expensive knives are. And then people collect them. And there's a lot of attention that goes into collecting specific makers when you go to shows. Yep. I didn't understand that. One of my really good friends, his name is Tyler Gray. He's a knife head. And he was always telling me about knives and like getting me to look at his phone and check this one out. What do you think of this one? I'm like, yeah, dude, it's a knife.
Right.
Like, okay, calm down, weirdo. What are you talking about? Or they're talking about a knife maker that you supposedly are supposed to know, because there's a lot of assumption where it's like people that get into anything. They're like, I really like this director of this movie, or I really like this guy, and they kind of assume a lot of things.
Caleb, did you know with Black Rifle Coffee's Coffee Club subscription, you can get fresh coffee shipped to you every month? What? You don't even have to go to the store. Whoa. You don't even have to leave your bed.
What? Wow. How did you get in here? You might want to go ahead and join the Black Rifle Coffee Club subscription before one of these guys shows up at your place.
The blade, what do you call it? The knife? What do you call it? The knife community? What is it? Is it the knife community?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's the knife making community and the collectors. And it's interesting. It's changed a bit because back when I was learning, most of the quote unquote famous knife makers back then were famous because they were fucking good.
Right.
Now it's different because with Instagram and whatever, like just because a guy has 300,000 followers doesn't mean he can make a knife worth a shit. But maybe he's really great at marketing. Right. Or got a name somehow. So I think it's a little harder for collectors that are new to sort out like who's popular and who's good. And that doesn't always match up. And I'm a little protective of, there's a lot of legends out there, great knife makers that aren't on Instagram right now, that it's kind of interesting. Back in the early 2000s, they were super popular and now almost nobody knows them. And I'm like, man, if you don't know Harvey Dean, or if you don't know Larry Fagan, or some of these different guys, like as a knife maker, you should educate yourself a little bit and look at the history. Don Fogg. It's kind of why, it's actually the number one reason I started my podcast was I wanted to get some of those old knife makers that I grew up learning from, their stories and their history and stuff recorded. So that way maybe you know, a lot of these guys are getting older, and when they pass on, if there's a new young star of a knife maker in 10 years and he wants to be like, how did this Damascus come back to the US? Oh, it was Don Fogg and Steve Schwarzer and Jim Schmidt that there were tiny pockets in the United States, up in the Northeast, down south, of 3 and 4 and 5 guys that basically like rediscovered and rebirthed Damascus into this country. Yeah. And like I did a podcast with Don Fogg. He was like literally one of the first to bring, Damascus steel goes back hundreds of years.
Right.
And it was lost. And these guys brought
it. Was really?
Yeah, it was lost. And especially in the US, there was no one doing it. Like in the 60s, there was nobody doing it. And then in the 70s, these guys started figuring it out, and with some help from a metallurgist guy that worked for like just a company, but he knew steel. Like they started playing with alloys and figuring out how to make Damascus again. So just a short time ago, like when I in the 90s, when I was learning, I just happened to be around this amazing group, and we were like Rick and these guys that I was learning from, we were flying these guys like Don Fogg into Montana and paying them to basically do what we called hammer-ins, where they would come and teach us. And the ideas were flowing. Like it was such an exciting time. They called us, I was a kid in it, but the guys that were around Montana, they called them the Montana Mafia. And there were articles written about them. And they were, Rick and all these guys were going back and forth with ideas. And instead of like figuring something out and hiding it from them, they would call each other on the phone and be like, dude, try this. I just did this with the steel. And what happened is it exploded. And so much of what you see in the Damascus world and knife making today came from that time period in the mid to late 90s. But it was born from those guys in the 70s. But those guys are now, they're 70s and 80s. They're starting to die. And
right.
It was cool because I'm young enough that hopefully I'll be around a long time to be able to tell people about those people. But I'm old enough that they were still active when I was learning. So I'm in a neat kind of middle area there.
Well, how is Damascus different than, and I understand because of the design, but what makes the design and how do you actually go through that process? Yeah,
Damascus is really two different alloys, at least two different alloys of steel that are combined together. And what you do, I kind of equate it to like red and yellow Play-Doh. And if you were to alternate layers of that and stack it up in a big pile, if it didn't all just smash together, let's say they always stayed separate, if you roll that out and you fold it or you cut it up and restack it and twist it, everything you do to it manipulates those layers. And then when you etch that steel, when you grind it off and you put it in acid at the end, the different alloys etch differently. So you'll have one alloy that's high on carbon and it'll be black.
Yep.
And the other alloy you use, the yellow Play-Doh, is high in nickel. And so it's silver, it's shiny. And so it's interesting because you can we've gotten it to where I can make a powder can. I can make a can and I could put BRCC. I could literally glue pieces of steel together and put BRCC in a can and pour powdered steel around that and forge that out and have BRCC in a blade.
Really?
Yeah. Like Steve Schwarzer in the 90s has an image in a Damascus blade of a bird hunter with a dog on point with his foot in the air.
Seriously?
Yes, with birds flying and a straight shotgun barrel shooting at these birds in steel. It's all steel. It's mind-boggling. Like that guy was so far and above. It's funny. I see people today like, oh, I came up with this pattern. It's like, that's cool. But I saw Don Fogg do that in the 90s. Like legends.
Right. That's insane to me.
Yeah.
That a person can do that in a piece of steel.
Yep. Yeah. You cut out, and it's a little different process. Like you're taking steel and you get a wire EDM.
Right.
And you cut all these plates. You cut this image out and then you fill the area that's missing with powder.
Right.
And of a different alloy. So now that area that's missing is now black instead of the silver that it was originally.
Right.
But that takes a really high level of talent and ability to, as you start to forge that, we're talking it's in a block that's maybe a 3-inch square or 4-inch square. And you have to forge and draw that out maybe 20 inches long and keep it square. So if you smash it wrong, it distorts the image.
Right. Yeah, my mind's having a hard time even figuring out how to do that, how to smash it without distorting the image.
Yeah, you got it's cool because if you do it with like a BRCC, it doesn't matter as much. If you distort it a little bit,
right?
Lettering then now it starts to look like it's written instead of like square and blocky.
Right. I got you. Yeah.
But if you're doing an image like that, it's very slow. You take little bites and you just keep it perfectly square, and you just take that 3-inch square and you stretch it to a 1-inch square.
Got it. That makes sense.
It's pretty technical, but what's cool about the collector world, there's people out there that make a lot of money in whatever they do, and they have an appreciation for people who do stuff with their hands and create and artists. And instead of buying a Charlie Russell painting for their wall, they're buying a knife and they're displaying it. And I always say, this is one thing.
I would love to have a Charlie Russell for my wall, by the way.
That would be nice. Yeah. yeah. That's a big check.
It's a big check. I would love to have that.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But what I always say about knife making, and I don't care if you're making production knives or if you're making high-end customs, knives are one thing that just never get thrown away.
No.
And I say about like, especially the customs that we all build, the knife making community, we're literally making future artifacts.
Right.
Like a lot of the knives I've made, who knows, maybe in 1,000 years, there's one in a museum.
Right.
Like, and even with our production knives that are less expensive, a $300 knife, or I have people that come into my shop all the time with a buck knife or a Gerber or some, what I'd say just kind of a plain folding knife with a tip broke off, and they want me to fix it and put an edge on it and buff it up because it was grandpa's.
Yeah.
And I'm going to put it in my safe. And even myself, I have a handful of knives in my safe that I don't even know where they came from. They're just random factory pocket knives. Mm-hmm. You don't throw those away. And in our world today, like, everything's made to throw away. Yeah,
everything is, one-time use or expendable. Mm-hmm. I have the first pocket knife my dad ever gave me. I have my grandpa's case folder.
Yep.
And that the blades are all like ground down from usage because they used them as screwdrivers and picking their, nails and cutting anything and everything. And I'd never throw those away.
I've literally had people bring me case pocket knives where all 3 blades are broke off. Like grandpa broke one and then just moved to the next. And the third one's broke off. And they've asked me to like buff up the brass bolsters, just buff up the bolsters. And they still just display it with like 3 little nubs sticking out of the front of the handle. But there's that nostalgia.
Yeah. And that's one of the things especially, I think you and I grew up in a very similar region, right? Like there's things that I'll never forget. Regardless of how old I am. My grandfathers, both of them, and my dad, so they were both loggers, and all of them were like 501 shrink to fits, and every one of them, I knew there was a pocket knife in their right front pocket. Every one of them.
You just described my dad.
Yeah. Like my dad wore, White's boots, 501 shrink to fit, flannel shirt. And there are things that I knew that he always had. One was a toothpick. Toothpick, pocket knife. Later, he used to carry a crescent wrench with him all the time too, like a little crescent wrench. Mm-hmm. Now he's getting older and he doesn't work on shit all the time, so he doesn't carry a crescent wrench and a pocket knife. But I know he always still has a pocket knife on him. If I walk up to him, I'm like, "Hey man, let me see your knife. I need to open something." And he's like, "Okay." Yeah. But growing up, that's every one of them. So it's a piece of your family's history, especially as a kid. Knives are one of those things that it's like, grandpa, trust me with the pocket knife.
Right.
Or,
now I'm kind of like, I'm almost a man.
Yeah. Like a big kid, my grandpa or my dad. And then if they give it to you, I took my daughter to get her first knife probably 2 months ago. So she really wanted a knife. And I was like, okay, like, you can have one, because I was teaching her how to make fire with a ferro rod and do a bunch of other shit. Yeah. But it was a big moment, right? You take your kids to we went to Bass Pro, and there you go. Like, take a look.
Check it out.
Swiss Army knife, because the classic children's first knife for me is like the Swiss Army knife, because you got a bunch of little tools in there, and it's super fun, right? It's like you got tweezers and toothpick and a pen, a bunch of stuff, and you also have some blades in there, none of which are really going to hurt you. But it gives her a really good starting point to start to learn knife safety.
Yeah, she can learn responsibility.
Yeah.
You can catch her doing some things she probably shouldn't be and be like,
Mhm.
hey, for me, it was like throwing the knife up in the air and see if it'll stick in the dirt.
Yeah.
Blade first.
Yeah. Well, and I had her earn it too, right?
Yeah.
So she had to earn it. She had to do, it was like 100 air squats or something like that. And then we take her in and get her. But now she wants a bigger knife because she's like, oh, I want a bigger knife to,
I need to
carve
give her a
on
card.
stuff. Oh, what?
Business card.
Yeah, exactly.
Sounds like she's a future collector.
She's a future collector. Yeah. You can start grooming them now for collecting later.
Your daughters, it was hilarious because the other night we were hanging out at your house and we were out back and we kind of there was like a little pile of wood there with some like slices of like plywood and boards and stuff.
Right.
And pretty soon those two little girls had their little boards out and they're sword fighting. And then like we're starting to mess with them and, kind of play fighting a little bit and they're jabbing us or whatnot. And then it's like we're standing there and then all of a sudden your older daughter, she'd sneak attack from behind and do the old Dumb and Dumber crack on the back of the calves.
Oh, yeah.
They were adorable.
She will wreck your world.
Oh, she was aggressive.
The youngest one, she does the sneak attack spankings. And I don't know, there's something about her hand size and the velocity of that thing.
Yeah.
She will tune you up.
Like a 223 bullet.
Yeah. It's like, ow, man. And I turn around and like, dude, what are you doing?
Yeah.
She just runs off and laughs.
No, she's cute.
They're going to be something special. I mean, obviously your kids are special.
Mm-hmm.
So speaking of kids, have you taught your kids how to do this stuff?
Yeah, my son is super interested in it. My older daughters have done some stuff. Like my oldest daughter built a really cool Damascus battle axe for a History Days project in school.
That's cool.
I mean, it's a neat.
Is it really?
It's badass. Yeah, and I sent it to school with her.
Is it all steel or does it have a wood?
It's got
handle?
A wood handle.
Yeah.
Yep. Got an ash handle that we burnt, and then we did a Damascus head, and it's got a spike on one side, and then the axe head on the other, and it's kind of funny. Like I was the only kid in school allowed to bring knives to school because I always bring them and show my teachers.
Right.
And we still live in an area in the country where, like, I wrapped it up and sent it to her. Put it in her backpack on the bus, and was like, "Don't take it out until you get to your teacher." Obviously,
right.
Like we don't need you swinging around, in the hallway. But no, she made one. My other daughter made a dagger for that same. 2 years later, she was in History Days, and she made a really cool little Damascus dagger blade.
It's cool.
They help in the Montana Knife Company part. That's what's really cool is, they come into my shop. Like when I worked for my parents, I did time tickets. I filled them out. Like I was an employee. I got paid. And same thing in my Montana Knife Company stuff. They come out. Even my 11-year-old daughter, she comes out, she signs in just like the other employees do. And I give her tasks like, hey, we need to put boxes together. A lot of the boxes that you buy from Montana Knife Company might look like a kid wrote on the box because
they did.
It was a kid.
Right.
But I don't force them to go out there.
Right.
It seems like it's becoming maybe more of a passion for my son.
Mm-hmm.
But, it's like anything. Like your kids probably will be like, coffee, whatever, tired of coffee. Maybe they'll find a different passion. But maybe as they get older, like my kids are starting to see what we're building.
Right.
And I think it's starting to trip. Instead of forcing them to do it at 10 or 11 like I was, maybe at 16 or 17, they're like, hey, this thing Dad's doing is pretty cool, and these people are cool, and I want to be involved. And if that's what they want to do, great. But, if they want to do something else, it doesn't matter to me what they do down the road. I'm pretty sure they're going to be successful just because they've had to earn what they've done. They have 4-H animals, 4-H steers, and pigs. And I think that's good because it makes them responsible for something other than themselves.
Right.
Well,
I think I think you're right. I think, having responsibility at a young age and having, your own business so you can force accountability. My kids know personal accountability from the age of 0, basically.
0. Yeah.
I hold them accountable for everything. And so when they come in, I just try to integrate them into what's happening. So like next week when we're at TAC, like they'll be cruising around at TAC, and just now that they're through, they had a cold on the last tack actually in Big Sky and kind of flowing into this. I don't know if it was from the smoke in the air or what, but just having them around, talking to people and interfacing with everybody, I think it's very important. Just for raising your kids right.
Yep.
Because if you spend time with good people, like guys like you and Bert Soren, all these other people, they're positive influences.
Yeah.
They hear the conversations. They hear what we're talking about, which is typically, business or family or hunting or some type of other recreation.
Country.
Yeah.
Yep.
And
like my 13-year-old son came to Big Sky with me. Just him and I, we stayed in the camper there on site, and he helped work the booth. I was really proud of him. Like I told him, I'm like, you're a representative of our company. We had a chat when we were coming down, and I said, I wasn't worried at all about how he was going to act, but I'm like, you have to represent our family and our company well. And, he was, anytime somebody came to the booth, he stood up, he was shaking people's hands, he was introducing himself. That's kind of, I told him that's kind of our deal too. Like if I'm talking to somebody, I don't introduce you, introduce yourself, because I can't remember his name, but he came and shot with us, Logan Stark and Trevor and a bunch of guys from Black Rifle and Sornex. And, it's funny you say that, because when I told Hank he was going to get to come to Big Sky with me, the very first thing he asked, he says, do I get to meet Bert Soren?
The Viking?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah. And, all these guys that Hank as a 13-year-old boy follows, a lot of, your people and whatnot. And, but he did a great job. He, 100-yard targets, he was moving up to 60 and shooting his bow, and teaching those kids how do you give a little bit of grief to adults, but still be respectful, like not disrespectful as a kid, and how to, when to shut up, when to talk. And it's just good for him, and it's good. And it also makes him feel like a little bit of a man, because he gets to be involved. And I told him, I said, I told him afterwards, the respect you earned this weekend was because of how you acted, not because you're my kid. Because if you were a shithead, those people wouldn't talk to you and want anything to do with you. Isaac Sr., and Junior were amazing with him. Isaac Sr. Just took him under his wing, and every time Hank was shooting, Junior and Senior were showing him tips, and Brady, and Hank was getting all these tips from all these men, and I was just able to stand back and kind of watch, and it was super cool,
Yeah, that's the great thing about having a business and then having your family interact with the business. My wife helped me early on for the first 2 years. She was bagging coffee and doing customer service tickets, and she earned her stripes. And the kids are going to be the same way. It's like when they get to an age where they can actually contribute, they'll contribute.
Yeah, and if you put them in the warehouse, it's like you listen to what these people say, and you guys teach them up. And
well, because they represent you too. At the end of the day, I think there's going to be zero doubt as to my, where my children land and what they have to do, because you have to make your own way, right? You have to carve your own mark, and regardless of whether or not I run this place or whatever's, that the social contract or the organizational chart, you still start at the bottom. Even the people that I've known for years still have to come in and start roasting coffee, printing t-shirts, doing barista work, doing customer service. I always talk to people, I'm like, every Marine is a rifleman, right? There's that saying in the Marine Corps, every Marine is a rifleman. Every person here at Black Rifle is a customer service representative, because if a customer comes up to you with a problem, regardless of where you work in the company, you still have to be able to solve the problem and be positive, professional, and polite, solve the problem. And that's, it's not like I'm giving life advice. I'm just saying, like, running a business, integrating your family in the business is already hard enough because you work all the damn time.
Right.
Just being able to see my kids, I'm sure you're the same way. It's like just being able to share time with your children at the workplace, because sometimes that's the only time I get to share my time.
Right, for sure. Yeah, and I think it's important too that kids, like with paying my kids, I could easily just be like, hey, I need you guys to help me for a couple hours out here putting boxes together. You live here, that's part of the deal.
Yeah.
I mean, I could do that, but instead, by paying them, they start to realize like, oh, if I work hard, there's something at the end of it. And like with my oldest daughter, who's going to be a senior in high school, that's kind of what 4-H has been. As I said, you're going to build up some money, and then you're going to have money to buy yourself a car. And so a few years ago, a knife collector of mine called. He's like, I got this car. It's a really great deal. I'm going to sell it. He's like, I'll make your kid a deal. So he sold it to her for $5,000 from out in Oregon, but she wrote the check.
Right.
And granted, I subsidize the 4-H stuff a little more than maybe some parents do. Like I pay for most of the feed and stuff. That I bought their first animal, and I pay for most of their feed, especially in the beginning. And instead of just handing them money and putting it in their account, they kind of have to earn it.
Right.
Now, still a lot of that money in their account's mine, but they had to do something for it. And so when she bought that car, she protects that thing like it's a diamond, because that's her money.
That's her money.
And I told her, like, if you wreck it or you screw it up, like you're going to have to figure out a way to come up with another $5,000.
Yeah. No, the easiest dollar you'll ever spend is somebody else's money.
Yeah.
Just ask the government.
Yeah. For shit.
Just ask the government. You know, that's the way I look at it. I was amazed, to switch back to some knives, but I was amazed at the work that you do on the knives that you've made, before Montana Knife Company under your name specifically. Right. And one of the things that we were talking about a couple of days ago is, do you still do that type of work? And how many knives a year are you doing, like custom under your name specifically?
Right. Right now, I'm not as obviously active on building the Josh Smith knives, because I'm trying to build Montana Knife Company and build this brand. And it's taken off at such a level that it's consuming. It's not just making the knives, but how do we grow? Right. How do we expand the business? What do we do about a building? Like all these things for next year and 5 years from now. Right. Which you understand all that. But yes, I still build the custom knives. Probably right now I'm on pace this year to build about 3. I want to build more down the road. And actually, like Brandon, my business partner, said, it's important that I keep doing those, so people see that. It's like when you roast a cup of coffee and you do a video about this coffee bean and how you do a pour over, you do whatever. It's like, okay, this guy's not just an executive at a coffee company. Like, he knows coffee inside and out.
No, that's why I brought out the ECS, because like that's my, that's my equivalent, right? So the Josh Smith label and the small batch, like very custom artisan knife, like this is mine. Right. So this is like, I get to do this every month, where I get to go through and profile the coffees and select them from origin and design the bags from ground up. Like everything that is in that box is something like I have a wet signature on. It's everything in the company actually is my signature on it. But I've been roasting some of these coffees since 2008. I'm not saying you should get bored of them. I want to continue to develop the craft as well, because what's going on in coffee, it's super important that the company's evolving too. And I love that section of the craft. Like,
well, that's why it all started.
Art. Yeah.
Because you love it.
Yeah. It's really fun. I don't get to spend as much time in the roaster, like the sample roasters, as I would like to. I think eventually I'll get to a point where I can kind of spend much more time there because I've been working on org charts and, building teams and all the other things that go along with scaling a business. The couple of questions, like, because I'm looking at those knives and I'm seeing so much love, so much love and attention to detail. Do you make every piece of those knives? Like, are you? Yeah. There's nothing you're like ordering. Like, are you making the screws? Like, literally everything that goes into it?
I don't make the screws, but I decorate. I like if you look at my screws, you'll see little like file marks and stuff. And like, instead of just putting a regular screw in a handle, I'll decorate it, I'll polish it, I'll heat color it a different color. Like, I try, even if it's stuff I don't make, which really, honestly, the screws are about it. The other thing that I don't do is I don't engrave. So if a guy orders a knife with a bunch of, say gold or, wants engraving on the gold or like the steel or whatever, I have certain engravers that I send that out to do like the scroll engraving or their Western engraving.
Right.
That's
Is that all local, or do you do it like wherever?
Kind of wherever here in the U.S. There's an engraver in Texas. There's an engraver in Oklahoma. There's 2 or 3 guys I use. A really good guy in Idaho.
Right.
But besides that, I make everything. Like if the guard and like when I make a switchblade, I mean, I'm making the button that catches it. And that's actually, I think, what's also cool about Montana Knife Company is like, I'm getting to a point where I'm not working on every single knife like I was.
Right.
But I still make, I mean, I showed you this weekend, I have a few prototypes.
Yeah.
Like I make everything by hand. A lot of times, several times. We just put a picture on our Instagram of like 5 of these Blackfoot blades that I had made originally.
Right.
I test them. Those blades were all heat treated at a different Rockwell hardness, so I could test the edge holding ability and stuff. And then I think that's part of why when people pick up our knives, they're like, that feels really good. Like not like a factory knife. And it's like, well, I make it until I get it perfect. And then I have it computer mapped.
Right.
So when you buy an MKC knife, that's like the exact knife that I originally made, you know?
When are you going to come out with an MKC folder?
Probably, hopefully, maybe next year. Maybe that adds a level of difficulty, you know. And honestly, we're so small. We're just growing, and I'm learning too. Like I was a custom knife maker making one knife at a time, and now I'm trying to figure out how to make 500 and 1,000 knives, and of all these different patterns. And I need to find help. I need to find somebody I can bring into my shop to run CNC equipment.
Right.
And, there's such a building process to happen here. We're coming out with chef's knives this fall.
Yeah, I'm super excited for that.
Cool. Yeah. And it's that whole idea of kind of from the field to the table, where you use our Blackfoot knife to get the animal out and cape it and do all that stuff, but then you're using our chef's knife at hunting camp to cook that first backstrap in, with Cole Kramer. And we're coming out with some fleshing knives and some skinning knives, and we're trying to expand our line. But like with the folders, I don't want to do anything. I won't come out with anything until I've got it right. So I'd be lying if I didn't say I'm playing with like designs and ideas in my shop.
Right.
But how do you produce that? I can make you one next week. Now, how do I make 1,000 more?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, that's the exciting thing, I think, with your company, your brand, and what you guys are doing. Like the quality of craftsmanship it's exceptional. I think you're in a category almost by yourself. Now, granted, I think of that is the entire brand itself. So who's behind the brand? Where is it made? Who are the people you're hiring? What do you believe in? Mm-hmm. Looking at the entirety of the company, it's a very special brand.
I appreciate that. Yeah, and that's something when my business partner Brandon, I hired him originally last year and to do some content, build me a website, and I was explaining to him, this is how I want my company to feel. This is how I want things to look, and this is what I believe in. And I started realizing as we went along, like everything I gave him, kind of tasked him to do, I'd get it back and be like, yes, that's perfect. Right. That's what I want. And so I brought him on as a partner where he's doing that marketing side and the Instagram and the website and stuff. But I am, they are all American made knives. Like I've had several knife makers come to me like, hey man, you can get some killer work done. Like you could have the same knife made in Taiwan and be half the price. And I'm like, I don't even want to discuss it. Like it's not an option. I will either succeed with an American made Montana knife company. I'll just go back to making my customs. Right. Like I can fold up shop and just make customs the rest of my life and be okay. Mm-hmm. I want a brand. Right. And yeah, they're going to be a little more expensive than a Benchmade or something, another knife, but, not the Benchmade. Benchmade makes great knives too. You know, there's room for all of us in this game. I had a guy this weekend, like pull a Benchmade out and apologize. And I'm like, dude, I carry a Benchmade. Like, I don't care. Like there's room for all of us. Yeah. But
it's kind of like coffee. It's like like coffee's, it's roasted by some. It's, it's better from some, depending on your taste, right? But I drink coffee from across the board from different companies all the time. Like, don't limit yourself. Like,
Right.
There's so many good brands out there that are doing great things for, their community. I tend to try to really give back to like veteran related causes and, conservation related causes, because that's what I'm passionate about. That's what I like to turn, my customers' dollars into, besides just, cool wood walls.
Yeah. And your company is such an inspiration for us because, I never served in the military, but I have, grandpas and family that did. And we want to be like, we're blatantly clear about how we feel about our country and our military, our fire and our police. And we're very clear about that on our Instagram. And like we did a fundraiser knife, Brandon Lilly from Sornex and Laura Zara. And we made a knife this spring where we made a Damascus pattern. And I had those guys each make a different pattern and I made a different one. And we combined it into one blade. And we raffled it off to raise money. And here in just a few weeks, we're bringing some veterans to our shop, about 15 or 20 to our shop to just teach them how to forge and cast a fly rod. And we're going to camp outside and Laura's going to teach some stuff. Cool. Brandon Lilly's going to be there and flex on everyone,
of course,
because he's a monster. But your company and companies like Sornex with Bert Soren, they feel like a family. Like when I'm hanging out here with your employees, it's like, I don't hang out with you a lot or Logan, or I've never met Jared, or, I just met Matt barely, but your employees like love the mission and love where they work. Bert Soren's people around him and his, like when we go to Winter Strong and whatnot, it's a family, it's a community, and all these brands supporting each other. It's just a big giant family. Like when you're at TAC, it's, whether it's some of the people from Leopold or Eberly Stock, the guys that Eberly Stock, same way the guys Glenn have, are amazing.
And all of us talk, like all of us are talking or texting or like, hey, do you want to do this? Do you want to do that? That's the cool thing about this ecosystem where we've put together a bunch of people that just love America. Not we specifically, I'm saying like collective we.
Right.
We're all working together, and it is, you're right. It's a big family where I get excited because I get to go see people like John Dudley and Bert Soren. Andy will be down here next week at Snowbird for that TAC. And these are my friends, they're my family. I love it.
And for me, it's not like I'm building a brand that I want to be around. Like I want it to be around. I want my son and daughters to be running this thing years from now, or grandkids or whatever. And it's all going to be built on relationships. The money side and the business stuff, like that will work itself out and come. It's more about, and I think that's why people are buying in, because I'm very clear on my Instagram showing like, hey, we're a small family doing this and we're trying to grow. But we couldn't do it without the people that are buying our knives and supporting us one knife at a time. But it's more of a feel of community and family. And like Lucas could easily have told you, like, oh yeah, he's all right, Josh's all right. But like he could have tried to hoard all the Black Rifle Coffee, customers and everybody to Grizzly Forge, right? It's not how, and it's not the community I grew up in. I was used to, in the knife world, we all lifted each other up. And when I remember standing there at my table and Tim Hancock, who's passed away, he would, bring a collector over and be like, hey, check out this kid's knives. And I remember doing that several times where I had folding knives on my table, Damascus folders, and a guy'd walk up and be like, I need a hunting knife. Like, can you make me a hunting knife? Well, I'm pretty backed up in orders, but like, let's go check out. This guy's really good.
Right.
Like, show you him. And it's like, really? You're going to show me your competition? Like, yeah, it's not.
Business isn't fun without competition. Well, Josh, tell me where everybody can find you if they want to order MKC knife or Josh Smith knife or however we want to.
Yeah. I mean, we have the MontanaKnifeCompany.com, our website, and Instagram at Montana Knife Company.
Yeah.
I have my own personal Instagram, Josh Smith Knives.
Right.
You get a little bit more of a feel of the family life and stuff. Brandon kind of keeps me off the MKC on the feed of, if I need to rant on something political or,
Yeah, same.
Yeah. I get a little wound up once in a while. But, and I have my website, Josh Smith Knives, where you can kind of see my customs. And I really appreciate it, man. It's,
dude, it's awesome. I love having you here. We'll do another one. Thanks, buddy.
All right. Thanks.
That concludes today's training. Any questions?